Good afternoon. I'm Ali Colón, the Knight Professor in Media Ethics at Washingtonton University. Welcome to this afternoon's conversation with Krissah Thompson, the Managing Editor of Diversity and Inclusion at the Washington Post. This conversation is presented by the Knight Program in Media Ethics and the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications. Krissah Thompson is the first editor of Diversity and Inclusion at the Washington Post. The Post has noted the following about her. She is the first Black woman to become a managing editor at the Post. She joined the Post in 2001 following graduation from the University of Texas at Austin, where she was in the journalism school and in the liberal arts honors program. She also earned a master's in journalism at the University of Maryland. So, switching my sheet. At the Post, she has been an intern, a business reporter, covered presidential campaigns, written about civil rights and race. Before becoming an editor in the style section, she covered the First Lady's office, politics, and culture. She has also been honored by journalism associations and was also the co-lead writer on the Post's N-Word project in 2015, which was nominated for a News Emmy Award and a contributor to its Being a Black Man series and book in 2006. I highlight these accomplishments noted by the Post because I believe her career and education signals the kind of background that not only makes her a first-rate journalist who can share with us her thoughts and how she sees how journalism's coverage needs to evolve to include a variety of people, but what I believe signals new ways to tell stories. Please welcome Krissah Thompson. So I'm going to now ask Krissah some questions. And
thank you for that introduction, Ali. Nice to be with you.
Well, thank you. And I'm really pleased to have you here. So, Krissah, let's start off with what prompted the Post to create the position of managing editor of diversity and inclusion?
Sure. So this job, which I wasn't involved in creating, but obviously now hold, was one of several that came out of conversations last year following the death of George Floyd. We saw some of the largest protests for racial justice that we have seen in this country in generations. And frankly, there were protests around the world, but there were also conversations within our industry and our newsrooms about what it looked like to really make sure that our newsrooms were representative of the communities that we cover and had the kind of perspective that could really sharpen our journalism. And looking at our newsroom, and particularly at the senior leadership ranks at that moment, it wasn't very representative. And so the decision was made to add this senior leadership role, but also to add some additional reporting positions. We created a position where we have a reporter who's covering environmental justice full-time, one who's covering criminal justice, a reporter writing about multiculturalism, a reporter covering race and identity for our feature staff. So we added a handful of reporting positions in addition to really help us, see around corners as we tell these stories, to add some depth and nuance to the report. But when looking at the masthead and thinking about how we really build and guide our newsroom into the future, how we build a deeper culture of belonging at the Post, the decision was made that we should expand the leadership ranks in order to include some additional views.
Good. Let me ask you this. What do the words diversity and inclusion signify to you? So how would you interpret them journalistically?
Sure. And I'm glad you asked journalistically, because I think that's an important point, right? We're not talking about diversity just for diversity's sake. We're talking about having additional perspective, shaping our news reports so that it really is covering the nation and the world that our mission is to write about, right? To make sure that our news stories have the depth that they should. I look at that in terms of the coverage, right? You want there to be a really interesting and compelling mix of stories that bring in voices from communities that have been underrepresented in the past. But I also think about how we operate as a newsroom, who's included in decision making when we're talking about stories, whose voices are at the table, who's able to offer ideas, the seed of an idea that then becomes what you're reading the next day. We're shaping the conversation for so much for our readers, for our audiences. So we want to do that in a way that really brings in more voices and more perspectives. And so when I think of diversity and inclusion, the journalism really is at the fore. And that helps us to think back, how do we operate as a newsroom? How do we, think about bringing people together, again, to shape the journalism?
Great. Let me ask you, this is a pretty significant position to have the Post create and then staff. And I wondered, what convinced you to accept such a position?
Wow. Thank you for the question. So, I've spent my career at the Post. I graduated and became an intern here. I thought I would be in this newsroom for a summer and then would find my first full-time job elsewhere. But I really just found the Post a place that I could grow and be challenged. It's been a newsroom that for me has been expansive enough that I feel like I've had many careers in this one place. And then about 5 years ago, I decided to try my hand at editing. I was ready for a new challenge, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I loved working with the team that I got as excited about their journalism as I was about my own. I really felt like I was using a different part of my brain to answer these big questions about how we build news organizations for the future. And even sitting in middle management, I felt that I had some ideas. I had something that I could contribute. And so when this position was created, it was a big jump for me to move from an assignment editor role to senior leadership in our newsroom. But this was a newsroom that really has raised me, that I know quite well, colleagues who, are friends and whose work I admire, and thinking about the kinds of change that I really felt like both our industry and the Washington Post needed to make, and being in a position to help affect some of that change, to me was a very compelling opportunity.
Good. And how do you think the staff responded, both to the position that was created and to you being a part of that?
Sure. To the position as it was created, I think initially there was some skepticism. This is a role that had not existed before. And we know journalists are rightly skeptical, right?
Yep.
And the way in which it was created and added to the leadership structure, it happened quite quickly. So people had lots of questions, and I think rightly so. I had questions about how this would work, how this would operate. I think that, the response to me in some ways, like I said, I've been at the Post for 20 years. So I'm a known quantity. And I think that having the opportunity to shape the role in dialogue with the newsroom, listening to people about what the needs are, and really giving myself and having my boss give me the space and time to really develop the role. Just recently, we've, evolved senior leadership a little bit more. So now my palette consists of, I'm overseeing our feature coverage and our climate journalism, along with hiring some recruiters for our newsroom. So I really think of the role as being very deeply focused on coverage and those specific coverage areas. Culture, how do we shape a culture that is welcoming, that's inclusive, a culture of belonging? in careers. How are we developing the careers of our journalists and making sure that this place remains as expansive as I found it to be over the course of my career.
Now, the other thing that struck me too as well, journalists can be, what's a nice way to put it, skeptical about certain evolutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so can the public, frankly. And in these times when people are thinking on a variety of levels about what everything means, particularly in the divide, I wondered if you had gotten any feedback or were thinking about the PC orientation that people might have and thinking, well, the Post is trying to get into the ground floor of the kind of political correctness of addressing these kinds of issues, and how you would combat that or convince people that that was not the case.
Yeah, interesting question. So I would just say for me, and I think some of this comes, I know that it comes from my experience as a journalist. Mm-hmm. I just always felt that the answer is not either or, it's both and. So in thinking about, for example, covering a topic like race in America, race and identity, is the right way to approach it having one reporter focused on that coverage, that topic area, or is that the kind of top subject that should be spread out throughout the room, right? Mm-hmm. We're well resourced, so we have the opportunity to say, yes, let's do both. Let's go deep. Let's have someone fully focused to make sure we're seeing around corners and telling the best stories we can about the subject area. Mm-hmm. But then let's also think broadly and know that if you're covering healthcare, you should be looking at race and inequity as a part of that story. If you're covering technology, what role does that question play? This is a huge question for the country. And so I think if you want to go deep and make sure that someone is focused on questions of inclusion, if we really want to move the ball, newsrooms have been saying for over 20 years that our goal is to have newsrooms that look like America. And we're not there yet, not at any major news organization. And so having a role with a more specific focus driving towards that goal, to me, makes complete sense. At the same time, it's no one leader's responsibility, right? Everyone has to be committed to moving in that direction. I think that, any idea to kind of advance us toward a goal of that sort can be discounted in some ways, but I see it as very valuable to both have the intense focus of an individual committed to the goal to kind of help partner with other leaders in the newsroom to get there.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting and good approach to do that. Having been an editor myself at a newspaper, what I found was that often people can kind of get caught up in their own little areas, right? It's like they have their own little pen, where they kind of stay inside. And sometimes when I was trying to encourage diversity, they would say, no, that's for the diversity people, right? That's the people who do those stories. But I'm covering the medical issues, or I'm covering transportation, or I'm covering City Hall. What's that got to do with me and what's going on? And so when they were trying to do that, if you have a team of diversity reporters, they may think, oh, that's the team's responsibility. How do you make that change so that they see themselves incorporated with you and the people that are focusing on that in a way that they see as substantial and beneficial to their coverage?
Absolutely. I think some of it comes from recognizing the expertise that it is to be able to tell these stories well, right? To have ideas that others don't have, to report out of, it could be your lived experience, or also just having great sources in underrepresented communities that, again, others in the newsroom don't have. And for editors and leaders in the newsroom to see that, to call that out as being valuable. I think that's really important and something that we should do more of. In the same way we value the expertise of being a great science journalist or political journalist. And we see that as, something that is worthy of praise. And we have to do the same thing with other kinds of reporting. I mean, we have a great tech reporter who has written some really incisive stories about the intersection of, technology and race and identity. And those are stories that, our readers come to and that other news organizations aren't doing in the same way. And so when we think about how we can really add value and think deeply, what she is able to do is extremely valuable to the Post. And that's something that we own. And so we have to call that out.
So how do we encourage the reporters who, have really created a beat or inherited one where they have become the beat in a way, right? To branch out, to be able to see wider perspective, more types of sources, because kind of naturally they think, hey, I'm the expert in this area. What else you want me to do? You want me to go out there and do these other stories that don't have anything to do with what I'm really trying to cover?
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I think one thing that we're able to do is to encourage collaboration, and sometimes bringing this expertise together with this expertise can give you something really interesting in the middle. And so doing that has been helpful. But I think we also have to find ways to challenge ourselves to bring diversity to those source lists, right? And some of that comes, it's been really interesting to look at how different teams in the newsroom have grappled with this. Some have taken it on head on and are having conversations. We had, for example, a couple of reporters on the education team who got together and said they wanted to think more broadly about the sources that they went to and built a source list and then shared it with the other education reporters to say, here are some new voices that we could be including in our report, and let's add to it and build on that and make sure that we're, again, thinking more broadly, sharpening the coverage, not just going back to the same well as we always do. So it's really nice to see that kind of bubble up organically. But then I think sharing that more broadly with the rest of the room to say, look, here's what they're doing and here's how it worked. And you can do that in your coverage area too. And rewarding that when we think about how we evaluate success is in calling that out as being successful.
That's a really good point too, because, what I noticed early in my career in some papers, they kind of put up when there were still lots of papers that they could put up instead of electronic ones, they'd put them up to a board and, they would say, this was one of the stories that was really good this week, right? That stood out. I never saw a story on diversity that stood out ever. As recognized as a major thing. And I wonder how that mindset gets addressed. And I'm sure that if we started putting those, right, people begin to see that. But it was just a recognition that what you reward is what you get.
Exactly.
So what are the rewards that they would find beyond having a good story? Is it placement on 1A, or is it a bigger section of the paper that they get to do?
Yeah. Yes to all of that. It's good play on the homepage. It's, making the front page, but also for us, it is being able to address those topics in the kind of collaborative way that we do for other big coverage areas. So last year, we poured a lot of resources into a series about the life of George Floyd, looking at the institutions that he intersected with in his life and asking the question about whether systemic racism, showed up in his life before he got to Minneapolis on that street corner. And, did that over the course of 6 stories, and they won some significant awards, and we had great video and photo to go along with it. So I think some of it is also, what are we willing to invest time, resources, our reporters' time into? What storytelling will we wrap those stories in? And kind of bring the full force of our journalism to. And I think it's important that those stories are also elevated in the same way that we would, the biggest political story of the day, in taking the time to give it the sort of thought that we do to our best journalism.
Oh. Now, there have been a number of Post reporters of color who have been advocating for changes in the way that coverage has been done at the Post for some time, and reaching out to communities of color to tell the stories that are there. I'm wondering, how will you see this manifesting itself now in that regard? We've been talking about this in other ways as well, but from the position of a reporter of color, will we see things that are going to address what they have been advocating for some time, but now may have an opportunity to actually see in action?
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, having spent many years here, I've served on a diversity committee or two myself. And there were times when some of the ideas from the committees were, acted upon, and others when they weren't. It really did feel like last year. And I think not just at the Post, but other major news organizations, that it was an opportunity to really affect change that I hope helps to bring us into the future of news gathering. I think that we are, as a news organization, lucky to be at a place where we can expand. We're adding editors to our ranks. New positions are coming online, and we're able to do that with an eye towards, again, making sure that our newsroom is representative of the communities that we cover. And I think it's really important that we keep that at the forefront. When I got into my role, I had staffers who pulled me aside to say, I'm on a team that isn't diverse, and we're talking about these issues. And I really think we should have a journalist of color as a part of these conversations. How do we deal with that? Again, if you're not in a place where you can grow, that's difficult, but we are growing. And as we hire, we have to think about, how can we make sure that these teams have the very perspectives that they need to in order to do their best work?
Now, since we're acknowledging really that most newspapers are still predominantly white, right? What's the strategy for helping the idea of diversity coverage? How does it take place when you've got a minority of people of color or reporters of color and then a majority of white? How is that going to change the mindset that's been there that you think in a particular way that might be successful, or an example of that? You've said they're going to collaborate some more, they're going to come together. I've heard that a lot before, and I haven't seen it happen in many places, and mostly it's inertia, right? And so I see that you may have some challenges in moving forward. And how do you see for yourself addressing that challenge, in addition to them cooperating, but actually sort of taking it into themselves that this is what really is a more complete version of journalism than the one that they've been practicing?
Absolutely. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's something that journalists are hungry for. There were people who were caught surprised by the mass protests that took place, and the real diversity that we saw in those crowds of people who, came out to protest on street corners after the death of George Floyd. That was a moment for this country. I mean, I think it did open some eyes, and we saw people, not just journalists, but certain books rise to the top of the bestseller list because they, in part were written to answer some of the questions that we have about the racial inequities that exist in our society. So I think, many of our journalists, even the hardened ones who've been doing this for a long time, they are curious people who want to have additional perspectives. And so some of it is just how we approach who is in the room to have the conversation about the story. And if we're at a place right now where the middle management and senior management is not very diverse, then you may be bringing a more junior staffer into that conversation but can you create an environment that's inclusive, where they can share their view on a story or their idea? Is there a place for those ideas to also bubble up and find support? And I think those are some of the ways that we have to shift. And again, I think it's just the journalist's curious mind that keeps people wanting to understand what is actually happening in our country. What are the things that I don't know that I should know? And they're willing to listen. And I think at the end of the day, we all know that it just makes the coverage better. And we have to be doing that, quite frankly, from many communities, from rural communities, making sure that we're outside of big cities, again, underrepresented voices of all kinds. How can we make sure that we're writing about what's actually happening?
So if that happens in that way, are there particularly new beats or specialties that you anticipate creating that will help build the momentum for those who are on those teams, particularly the ones in diversity inclusion, to go out and see the world in a different way, that'll come back with new stories?
Yeah, I think we've already seen some success with that. We have a reporter who joined our healthcare team to write about race and equity in health. And some of the stories that she's done out of COVID have been, really interesting and deeply inside communities, getting at, what we have seen in healthcare and the impacts of the pandemic. So that's just one example. We had the census, that came out this year, which showed in many ways that we're looking at the most diverse cohort of young people that the country has ever had. And so thinking about, okay, what does that mean? How do we tell that story? And we've done some great reporting around again, just what that means and how people are thinking about the change that's taking place there. So some of it really is just following the news and putting people in position to, think beyond what is coming from the same buildings and institutions that we've covered one way for a very long time, and what are the voices outside of that we should be listening to, writing about, elevating.
Okay. Are there particular things you are trying to initiate that will make it more encouraging for those reporters who haven't been doing this kind of work in the past to see this as a way to expand their coverage area and to expand the kind of stories that they could do?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, not every reporter is going to be writing about race and identity. And I think that that's absolutely fine, right? We need some people to just be writing about what's coming out of the White House. That's also important. I just think in every coverage team, in those conversations, there should be people who can see some of the complicated stories around identity that do rise up, that we should be paying attention to and thinking about. And so, yes, we want to create incentive. And I think we do that by celebrating the good journalism that is happening on these topics and in those spaces, and encouraging people who have ideas to come forward with them, and that we'll resource them and support them. And then, the other thing that has been a great part of my job is just to be able to contribute to, giving my view on the news report every day, the stories that I think are interesting, and, pieces of a long narrative that maybe raises a question for me that may not have been a question for another reader, and being able to share that perspective in a broader way with our newsroom. And I think that is also important and contributes to the report.
Good. And so will you see yourself as an encourager to the reporters and maybe other editors to see the broader landscape filled with different types of people and experiences, to get them encouraged to go out and see this as a new world that they may not have paid attention to before?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there is a hunger to do that really from our in our newsroom. People want to make sure that we're understanding deeply the divides that exist in our country. I mean, in Washington D.C., obviously, we have seen that up close and sort of understanding the origins and the continued bubbling up of just the disunity that exists in America and going to places that allow us to, again, hear those voices and tell those stories. I think that our journalists really understand and know that it's one of the most important stories in the country right now, and so they're hungry to get out there and tell it.
Okay. With the declining population of white people, I mean, it's going to be over time, but it's still continuing to decline. What do you believe will happen to the news coverage focus?
That's a good question. I think coming from a large news organization, when we think about that question, we think about our audiences, right? Who still tend to be older and less diverse than the country as a whole. And so when we think about how we, sustain and grow, it really is about reaching younger audiences and more diverse audiences, and not letting go of the audience that has sustained the Post and other major news organizations over the years, but really thinking about where are the platforms that younger people and more diverse people are getting their information, and how can we make sure we're reaching them there and bringing them back to the Post. And some of that is you come to publications where you can see yourself. And so we have to be telling stories about young people and, again, underrepresented communities in order to really be resonant.
I recently read, the Washington Post article, which I do read pretty regularly. And I was struck by this story that it was an article in the Post with the headline, "This tribe helped the Pilgrims survive for their first Thanksgiving. They still regret it 400 years later." Mm-hmm. And it wove history. But what I was struck by as well, it went to present day situations where you had a particular, not only do you have the Plymouth where everybody seems to go to and the Plymouth Rock and the ship and all that kind of stuff. Then they got a little, as they articulated and presented, a very small little kind of recognition of the I think it's the Wampanoag nation, nation that was there, trying to, in a way, tell their story as well, right? Mm-hmm. Is this maybe an example of the kinds of ways that the stories of the future will be not only specified in their focus, but integral in the way that they are looking at different and a variety of sides of the story?
That's right. Absolutely. That's a great example. Thank you for calling that out. And I will add, the reporter who wrote that story has been at the Post for a very long time. And she happens to be Native. And so she saw that story and had a great editor to work with in order to tell it well. That's not her beat. It's not what she does every day. But thinking about this moment, again, 400 years of Thanksgiving, going to the origin story, telling that history, but doing it in a modern way. It's a great example of, again, creating space for people to do their best work.
I'm noticing, too, that you're adding audio to a number of stories so that people can listen to it. And I'm wondering if that's also another way to reach people, on different levels and different places who may or may not have the time or the inclination to read something that's quite long, but are willing to listen to it, and maybe reaching to another population that, may benefit and find that more accessible.
Yeah, and it is really an accessibility question. So we have, we're growing audio in two ways. For one, it's on our apps and our website, where if you're moving around your house and you just want to listen to a story, have someone read it to you, that the app will allow you to do that. But we're also growing our audio team in terms of the podcasts that we offer and the ability to get Washington Post journalism, again, in audio form on podcasts. We have our daily, signature podcast post reports, and are thinking about ways that we can really harness just the strength of our journalism and our deep reporting and bring it again to other platforms. Mm-hmm. You probably saw also on election night, was that just last week? It feels like it was forever ago now.
I can't remember time anymore. It's no longer in a straight line, If
you came to the Washington Post website on election night, it was dominated by our live show where we have, just great journalists who are on air broadcasting and talking about what we're seeing, analyzing in real time, bringing in the smart journalists that you love to read right there on our website and taking you through that story again in a video format.
Yeah, and it reminds me a bit, I listened to a podcast called Scene on Radio, SCENE, okay. And they've done some really good stuff on race and the history of this country, mm-hmm. sort of doing what you did very well with the Native American story and how they felt about the good deed they had done, which turned mm-hmm. out to be a bad deed for them. And there is an opportunity, obviously, not only to read, as you've noted, but to hear these stories in ways that might have people, do you think, more attuned and connected to the story than just reading it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, audio is such a powerful, storytelling tool. It's been really great to see us invest in it and to see what the opportunity and power is. I was able this year to work with our audio team on a series about teens in America that focused on race. And we partnered with YR Media, a nonprofit media organization that used to be called Youth Radio that works mm-hmm. with young journalists, with teenagers, to do reporting and storytelling. So our audio team partnered with the teen reporters mm-hmm. and really were able to draw out some amazing stories about what it's like to grow up in one of the most diverse cohorts that this nation has ever seen, and to grapple with some of the questions that come up in their own lives, and to hear their voices and the conversations that they're having with their friends or with their parents about these issues. It just really takes you into the story in a way that I don't think, only reading the pieces would. So I think, that's a question that we are always asking ourselves at the beginning of the storytelling. In what form does this story really want to be told? It's very easy at a place like the Post to go back to our default, which is, of course, to write a long, beautiful story. Mm-hmm. But really, what form does the story want to be told in? And should it be audio? Should it be video? Is this a graphic? Should it be, is it all together? And how do we make that happen in a really cohesive way?
Yeah, I'm struck by that too, because I'm thinking about the ways that we can engage readers, listeners, into the stories that we're telling. Mm-hmm. And how do we help them see that we're doing that? And is there a way that the Post is going to be, besides on its pages or online, are there other things that you're thinking about to basically increase readership among those who may have thought that Post is primarily a political paper, in DC, or a basically conventional paper in the sense that it goes to the same sources? Although I know they've done a lot of variety, but how do you think you're going to go about getting the audiences of the people that you're hoping to reach and to get them also to be looking to the Post as an avenue for getting their stories out?
Yeah. I mean, it really does come down to, I think, just doing journalism that's irresistible to people, mm-hmm. That they will see, maybe it comes through their Instagram feed. Maybe someone shares it on Facebook or Twitter. They see it, they come across the story, and it's a topic that they just have to read about. And they click that link and they mm-hmm. come to our paywall and decide, I'm going to subscribe because this is something that I really want. And we do live in a time where people have a ton of subscriptions. I mean, think about it, Allie. They have Spotify, which they pay for, and Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and everything else. And so I think as an industry, we've done great work in the last couple of years in really beginning to socialize people to value paying for news, that this is something that is worth, your dollars, your $10 a month or whatever it is. And to just see the value of having fact-based information that you can come to. So it is, our political report, but we also have so much more than that. And I think, the reason why people subscribe and stay is because they then see that we have great food coverage in addition to great investigations and all of those things that just provide, again, a really rich experience. But part of that has been getting people to, again, after so many years of media organizations making news, free online, that this is something that's valuable. It's worth you paying for.
Great. And, it seems ironic to me in a way that as I think papers like the Washington Post are reaching out to increase the variety of readers or users or listeners, right, to all the type of work that you are doing, that our audience is splintering into so many different facets and particular streams of information and groups that they want to belong to. And so I'm somewhat curious about, as journalism broadens its own orientation to reach more people, people are separating from themselves to live in silos and listen in silos. And I was wondering what you thought about how can journalism, and at one time it was a unifier, right? Mm-hmm. A place where all people went to get their information, now is in a situation where if it's sort of not chaotic music, it's certainly close to it. And I'm just wondering how you might see the opportunities to fuse those together.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's a big question, kind of having watched that happen during the course of my career in journalism. Is something that I've thought a lot about. And I think we can use cable news as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of looking at what it meant to go from having that kind of unifying experience of the nightly news to a really fractured ecosystem of a lot of opinion based, some would call it journalism, some would just call it a lot of opinions being spewed on cable news. And I think for mainstream media organizations like the Post, holding really fast to that commitment to fact-based journalism and also doing more to show our work. I mean, one of the things you begin to realize in this business is that there are very few people who really understand what goes into the journalism that we do, the number of people that we talk to, the work that goes into verifying those facts, the copy editing that takes place. I think so. Being very transparent about that, having a really high bar for when we decide to use anonymous sources or not, thinking about how we can allow our journalists, whether it's in chats with readers or in other places, to talk about the process of pulling the work together, right? And I think all of that helps to demystify it a little bit. There are some people who are going to be skeptical. We did have a leader in the White House who for a period of time, called media organizations, quote unquote, fake news. And as our former executive editor, Marty Barron, said, we're not at war, we're at work. So we have continually been focused on doing the work, on telling stories that people need to know, on presenting reliable information. But we do live in an age of misinformation and disinformation. And so making sure that we are teaching media literacy, I think, is also key. In having conversations about that, even in our homes. So, that our loved ones and friends were able to say, you know what, that's not real. Let me show you how and why, right? It's a specific kind of skill. And now there's so much more access to anybody can publish something, on the internet. So I think that's something we have to continue to be really thoughtful about. And for journalists ourselves, I think it matters to build that trust. We have to be more transparent than we've been in the past. Again, about how we do our jobs.
Yeah, I can see that, because if there's one thing that we seem to be seeing is either there's no transparency or there's so much transparency it can scare you as to what you're seeing come out. Especially in the news today. I want to check with Brandon Busey to find out if there have been any questions coming in that we want to share with Krissah. But until
I think folks were just waiting for the Q&A to ask questions.
Okay, let's go to the Q&A now. I've enjoyed my Q&A, so can't hog it. But I find this to be obviously an exciting but challenging time, having been a reporter and editor for more than 30 years and been engaged in trying to foster a more complete, and diversified coverage. It feels like a long wait. So seeing somebody, an organization like the Post do that, I think is pretty inspiring and as well as challenging. So we have a question from Mary Alice. How does it feel being the first Black woman to hold this position when people ask you about it?
Let's see. I think about my grandmother a lot.
Yeah.
And I just think about, I think the journalists who come before me, who really have paved the way for me, and the people in my life who encouraged me as a young person doing this work, and, my own support in cheerleaders. And I think about the journalists who are in our newsroom now, who are really hungry to see our industry evolve and change and have great ideas. And I think about building space for them. And I have been at the Post for so long that it really does feel like home to me. So I can, very easily embody this space. And so it doesn't in any way, the only challenge is, can we be creative enough to take advantage of this opportunity? I mean, as you said, Allie, this is something that our industry has been talking about for a long time. Can we figure it out now? That's the real challenge. So I'm just excited to have the opportunity to be one of the people doing this work.
Yeah, I sort of think that the answer is actually the question. And it's in the question that we find some answers, but in fact may require us to ask more questions and then grow in that way. I have another question from, hold on. I had one that's here that had to do with what happened on the coverage with regards to, and this is from Jackson Sharma. He says, what is an example of something you have seen in the Post newsroom that would not have happened before George Floyd, either coverage or conversations, et cetera?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for that question, Jackson. The coverage, I think our coverage has been really sharp for a long time. The kinds of conversations that we're having around inclusion, race, equity, I think we haven't been having those conversations in a robust way for a long time. And that has become much more routine. And again, I think more staffers are empowered and feel empowered to raise those questions. And I think that's been a really important outcome before we can get to the changes that we need to make in the solutions. The door has to be open to have the conversation, and that's clearly happening.
Good. Jen Nee, another question has and says, have you or other writers of diversity/inclusion and equity beats received hate messages or email? And how do you handle these? And is there a difference in how you would handle it personally versus how you should handle it ethically versus how the newsrooms wants you to handle it?
Yeah.
So there are a number of questions there, but
Mhm.
I think you get the gist of where she's coming from.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jenny. As a reporter and as a reporter who for a period of time wrote about race, yes, and absolutely. And not only wrote about race, part of my career I spent covering the First Lady's office. And so I wrote about Michelle Obama during her period, during her time as First Lady and the beginning of the Trump era and Melania Trump as First Lady. And I would say, some of the racist and vile emails that came across, would shock you. This is not institutionally speaking. This is, me as a reporter and receive those. I mean, most of them just didn't get my attention. Again, it's just my disposition. I would delete them and move on. Less of that happened for me on my social media feed, but I am, as a newsroom leader, am very aware of the arenas in which our journalists are asked to engage with our audiences and the kinds of attacks that can come, the misogynist attacks, the racist attacks. We've had journalists who've been attacked just for practicing journalism and asking a question. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to support them and also to create the kind of understanding and culture in our newsroom so that people who are not from underrepresented backgrounds know that just in doing my job and writing a story about the current First Lady, I'm getting hate mail. Like, I think that would surprise a lot of people. But we have to make it, we have to make more people, I think, aware of that environment so that it's not just like a toxic stew that one reporter is having to sit in. And we've quite frankly been having that conversation around, some of the comments that will show up at the end of our articles, and whether or not those should be places for people to leave comments that, again, are sometimes not just racist and vile, but unkind, and thinking about how we grapple with that.
Yeah, I can think that can be really challenging. Naila Rahman wants to ask, do you think enough is being done to diversify the staff of news media staff? If not, what more can be done?
Yeah, no, I think all media organizations need to do more. Part of that is really, one, it's helping to develop the pipeline of young journalists. I think all major media organizations should be a part of that. But it is also about developing relationships with candidates over potential talented journalists over the course of their lives, and thinking more creatively about who we hire into these roles. We're in a situation now where, the major metropolitan newspapers that, were around 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that were great places to grow as a journalist. And maybe you worked at the Houston Chronicle or the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Corpus Christi Caller Times, some smaller paper, and then worked your way up to the Washington Post. In many ways, those have been decimated. And so some of the most talented young journalists are working for like the Athletic or, the 19th or some other website. And so we have to think outside of the box in ways that we hadn't in the past. And again, also be really focused on developing talent within our own newsroom.
Great. Bob Cundy's asking, how do intelligent adults in this nation ever conduct a conversation about current issues when one camp data source is based in reality and the other camp's data source appears to be based in fiction?
Oh, Bob, that is that is the question, right? And I have to think this in part because I don't know. I feel like that journalism is really a calling in that way, that we just have to keep putting the facts out there and doing it in a really clear-eyed way, doing it in a way that people who are coming to that information from different perspectives can see us as fact-based and neutral arbiters who have, again, as the younger people would say, the receipts to show you that this reporting, again, is something that you can trust and believe in.
Good.
Have to keep trying.
Just don't stop, right?
Yep.
You got to keep dealing the cards until everybody gets one, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Sophie Kidd asks, has your new position come with any unexpected obstacles from your audience or in Washington? And she also says, hello from a fellow Houstonian.
Yay. Hi, Sophie. I miss Houston. I haven't been able to get there very much during the pandemic. Obstacles. I think that the pandemic has actually been quite a huge obstacle for me in this role of doing the kind of work that I hope to do. I'm in our newsroom right now. Our office is open, but our staff is still primarily remote. And I think to have some of the conversations that we need to have around the topics that Allie and I have been talking about, you want to be able to do that in person. You want to be able to drop by desks and hear what people are thinking, the things that are worrying them, their ideas for how we continue to shape the Post. And so that has been, pretty difficult to do, over the last, I guess we're going on 2 years. Yeah, 2 years or so. And so doing that all in a remote way has been challenging. In terms of the audience, I think it probably does just go back to the kinds of attacks that will come that our journalists face, and making sure that as a newsroom, we are there to support them, that we're not asking them or in any way mandating that they be in spaces where these kinds of conversations take place, where they're attacked just for being who they are and practicing journalism. I mean, one of the things that I think that I'm very clear on is for some people, your identity is politicized just because of how you show up in the world. People will have certain ideas about who you are and how you think, and will at times, lob things and sometimes nasty things at you just because of that. And we as an institution have to be a place where we support our journalists from all backgrounds, and also make sure that that they're not being subject to that kind of thing.
Good. Grace Mammon says, we've been talking in our ethics class about how stories from non-race beats that mention issues of race are immediately interpreted as controversial. What has been your experience with incorporating race into stories from other beats, and what response do you get from readers?
Again, I think that you have to be a sophisticated journalist to do that well. I think we've had success, but that's because we've been really thoughtful about the journalists who we brought on to tell those stories. So I think I mentioned that we hired a journalist to cover, race and equity in healthcare. And she's done an excellent job. She has a lot of expertise, both in that subject area, but also in covering race. And so thinking, very thoughtfully about how you bring together those topics, and again, do it with the kind of nuance that is deserved, that subject area deserved, is really important. And, I think the response from readers varies. There are readers with whom these stories connect with, really well, and they're glad to see them. And for some, it will be telling them something that they were unaware of, and as Bob mentioned, maybe disbelieve. But our job is to do the reporting, to make sure we do it in a complete way, in a fact-based way, and to share those stories.
I'm wondering too, Krissah, technology has kind of evolved in ways that we may not recognize. I mean, before, reporters went on the street, went places, talked to people. Then the telephone came along, right? And we started calling people and having interviews on the phone. And then we get television and we get broadcasts doing this, and they begin to interview people on the screen and you're watching them. And so now we're moving into a variety of ways we do this, but we're into Zoom. And I'm in agreement with you. When you can be with people, there's a certain energy and magnetism that takes place and creation that takes place. But this is the reality for a lot of people. And what we can do to communicate, is there a way for things like Zoom to further the journalism, further the discussion in a way that obviously people can't even get out now to be in their own offices or don't want to? Mm-hmm. How does this look in the future of communication from your standpoint as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very early on. I think all we could see was the challenge, right? Like not being able to be on the scene to tell the story, or having to do that with so many more precautions than we had before. And then I think the world began to open up a little bit, and we started to get more accustomed to some of these tools. And we have seen our reporters do interviews on Zoom, and they will be looking and getting some color from your background and saying, show me that art piece that's on the wall, and using that in the story, in the reporting, and, maybe getting access to some sources that they would not have otherwise if they had to meet up in person, right? And I think about the same thing when it comes to reaching potential job candidates or things, right? Like, can we have Zoom job fairs with our hiring managers and reach out to college campuses in that way and bring more people into the conversation? And so, most of these things, you can get 500 people on a grid and all make sure that they're all getting the same information at the same time. So it's a challenge, but there's also an opportunity there. And I'm so impressed by our newsroom and our ability to continue, through these really tough conditions, to just do amazing journalism that does really still take you there, that is insightful. And, it makes me feel like no matter what comes our way, we're gonna keep doing this work.
Great. Well, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have you on as our night program speaker this year. And I'm so glad that you were able to take the time. I know how busy you are and a lot of other situations that are calling for your attention. But I think this is going to prove to be a really enlightening and I hope informative type of discussion that people can take away from in a way that they might not if they were actually, either just listening to it or if they couldn't get to it at all. But I really appreciate those who've been viewing this and asking the questions, and Brandon Busey, who has done a really good job of engineering. So I actually look a lot better with his help than probably would otherwise. And Joan Millen, my assistant, who's been in with doing the work with our institute and helping to make connections. Again, thank you so much. Washington Lee is very appreciative of your being part of this conversation, and I hope we'll have another conversation again.
Great. Thanks for having me, Allie, and thanks for all the great questions. Glad to be
Okay.
with you all. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.